Okay. Hey, good everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on Codes 101. This webinar is recorded and the recording's posted to the Code Adoption Toolkit usually within a week or two. So give us a little time to get that up there. If there are any issues with audio, please feel free to write me in the chat. And my name is Erica Jalalo. I'm a senior project manager for Noresco. And this series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Glenn Mathewson. All right, so just to talk a little bit about some of the trainings that Glenn and I have been working on and that are upcoming. This is the first of our uh, new series on Codes 101, but we've got a whole bunch of others that are queued up through the beginning of next year. I know that some of you have already registered for those trainings, but please keep an eye out for an email as we might have to change platforms, which would require you to re-register. So just as a little note there to keep your eyes peeled for an email from me. We do also offer other types of training, including role-based training, which is basically tailored to a specific code user. So if you're an architect, an engineer, a building inspector, a plans examiner, we have training specific for you and your role when complying with the energy code. So if you're interested in those, feel free to reach out to me and we can set something up. And then, of course, we do any kinds of in-person trainings on topics that you're interested in. There's also a bunch of those previous recordings and short video clips available on the Code Adoption Toolkit. We do provide technical assistance for code adoption. So if you're just jurisdiction looking at adopting the 2021 I-codes, reach out to me and we're happy to help you guys throughout that process, whether it's attending stakeholder meetings, city council meetings, writing your code language, helping you apply for grant funding from the state. We're here to help. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of different resources on the Code Adoption Toolkit. There will be an overhaul to the website in the coming months. So bear with us a little bit, but there's a plethora of resources available on there, including the Codes Helpline, which I want to note has a new platform link to it. It's shown on the screen here, and you can also scan the QR code to get to it. You can submit any question related to the building codes, and a subject matter expert like Glenn will respond to you in just a couple business days. So definitely utilize that, as it's a great resource that we have available in our beautiful state. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you, Glenn, to take it from here.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Let me.
And you've got a comment says, "Welcome, Glenn. Break a leg."
Woo! I'm seated safely in my chair, so I might break my fingers on the mouse here. All right, let's find the right desktop to share. And how? All right, is everybody seeing Codes 101 with the big old family of I codes behind there?
Looks good, Glenn.
Looks good. Okay, then let's get going. So yes, this is Codes 101. And it's exciting. It's another kind of brand new webinar. I'm telling a lot of these Wednesday webinars for this program here are prompting me to create new content and new webinars. So that's always fun for me. And you guys get to be my test dummies. No, you're not dummies, but you know what I mean, the old-fashioned test dummies. So let's see how we do. Quick little introduction. My name is Glenn Mathewson. I'm just a construction code dork my whole life. Started in construction when I was 19 as a laborer, sweeping up houses for a framing contractor and restacking the lumber. And then I've just been on a fun journey for the last, I don't know, almost 30 years. And that's brought me here today to being an independent building code educator and consultant. So as you can see, this collage of my career, I do a lot of work in a lot of places for a lot of different folks and a lot of different audiences. But the number one thing that ties it all together is I just want to enlighten and empower and inspire you about building codes. And that means you, whether you're a do-it-yourselfer, you're a plan reviewer, you're a contractor, a tradesperson. I think building codes are for everybody. And so I like to be a positive and proactive voice about that. And that's long enough because I only got 60 minutes, and these 60 minutes are tough for a guy like me. I like full day classes because I just love to hear myself talk. You have to do that when you're all alone talking to your computer like a crazy man. So let's get on with what we're going to do today. I have tried to set up a structure for myself so I'm not completely off the wall and disorganized. These are the topics I'm going to get through kind of in order here. And we're going to be doing this super high level. This is 30,000-foot view, and we don't have parachutes. So we're staying in the plane, and we're not going to go too close to the surface. We're going to start with talking about politics and history. And don't worry, it's not the politics like the ugly stuff, right? By that, I just mean government relation to building codes, because, you know, we can't not have that. That is part of this. And then we'll talk about ICC model codes. That's the International Code Council model codes. I'll go through with you a little commonality about the organization of model codes and how they're organized, because, you know, what good is it to have this book in your hands or a PDF on the screen if you don't have a sense of confidence and empowerment to go, I can open this and find my way around. So that's part of Code 101, is just how are these books organized? Adoption and amendment of the codes. And that's going to lead us to what? To what? Colorado codes, because that's where we are. This is Colorado. Now, usually all my education is about the model codes for everybody. But, you know, when I'm doing work for Colorado specifically, we will talk a little bit more specific about, you know, some nuances, 30,000-foot view of Colorado codes. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with a little bit more specific talk about energy codes, because indeed, you know, that is where our funding is coming from for this work. And that's where a lot of the motivation, you know, I would love to just share with you about codes, but are you actually interested? Well, that's why you kind of sometimes have to use the trending topics that people are interested in, energy codes. And then I'm going to sneak in all the other code stuff too, right? But we'll give energy codes its little special time at the end. Okay, so let's get into this, and let's start at the highest level of what people think about codes in America. So, right, the United States of America. Why don't we start there? And let me just kill the titles of all these books: International, National Electric Code. There's nothing federal or national about these things. The federal government does not have any authority over building codes in the United States, our federal government. So again, that's the first thing people get confused of when they see these titles for these books: International Building Code, National Electrical Code. They are not created by our federal government. Now, that said, I'm going to give you that 30,000-foot view, or maybe this is more like a tap on the shoulder reminder. A lot of things you're going to hear me talk about in this class are part of that inspiring part of my goals. I want to inspire you to be like, man, Glenn mentioned something about the Department of Commerce, but it was just a quick 60-minute webinar. So I want to inspire you to realize there's so much more to learn. This webinar, those topics, I could make this a full day class. And I'm working on that, guys. I'm working on that too, by the way. Like 3 people will attend it probably. Anyway, Department of Commerce, money. Federal government has a concern over commerce in the United States. Constructions related to commerce. So yes, historically, and maybe into the future, we'll see agencies of the federal government, like the Department of Commerce, have some overlap with building codes. But again, the federal government doesn't get to write or create or dictate building codes. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, well, building and developing land here in the United States involves our environment. And so you do get some overlap and some programs and things that come out of the Environmental Protection Agency that can have an influence in building codes. And then, of course, Consumer Product Safety Commission. Well, buildings are permanent construction that we put together with materials, and what else? Products get put into buildings. Now, the government, federal government, does have the ability through this agency to have authority over products. And so we do see some overlap with products used in construction. And then the Consumer Product Safety Commission is recognized in the code as, hey, they actually have the ultimate authority over these products. And then, of course, the Federal Housing Administration. And I'll give you some fun little historical stuff about that. You're going to get some historical stuff all throughout today. If you see the picture behind me, I'm also a building code historian. That's why I'm invited to all the social events and all the parties. They're like, man, bring Glenn. He'll tell us some cool history about codes. Yep, true story. So Federal Housing Administration has a bunch to do with building codes and construction and kind of not. And so some fun stuff there. So back to why can I so confidently say the federal government has no authority over building codes is because we have a document that specifically states what authority our federal government has. It's the Constitution of the United States. Great document, plenty of controversy. Keep that for yourselves. But when we go to that document, we see that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, I've got the explanation there, the brief explanation there for you. It says, look, if this document does not specifically give this authority to the federal government or prohibit it to the states, then it defaults to the states. And so this is the core and the starting point for understanding building codes in the US. The Constitution does not give authority to the federal government, and therefore it defaults to the states. Now, if we go way back in time, centuries ago, when we've had building acts, which were the early building codes going back to 1600s. So been around before we were even a united group of states. And if we go way, way back then, and even after the United States was born, the states didn't really take authority. And it was basically all the way down to the cities and counties that wrote their own building codes. As you can see, some of these examples in my collection. Look, there's Denver from 1916. So it was always states doing their own codes. But, that was troublesome, right? Because, there is politics involved with codes and with how beautiful your city looks and what you're going to allow to be built on the main ways through your city, the avenues versus the side streets where you can let the lesser folks live. And so there were a lot of politics involved with the creation of these codes. We see it a little today, and we've seen it for all of history. And so the National Board of Fire Underwriters had to pay for all these buildings that failed, right? When building codes for fire protection weren't sufficient or people weren't following them, they ended up paying the bill. And so the National Board of Fire Underwriters were the first people, the first group to say, maybe we shouldn't just let politicians and governmental employees and government leaders and municipal leaders be the ones creating the building codes. Because you know what? They're not really doing a great job of it. And all these places keep burning down. So National Board of Fire Underwriters came up with the first concept of a model code. This is one of theirs from 1920. And notice the title, right? A code of suggestions. Well, isn't that weird? What kind of code is just a suggestion? Well, a code from a non-authoritative source. So, right? Insurance underwriters had no authority. So, but they created this model code, and then they tried to encourage the cities to say, hey, we really would like you to kind of uniform together and let's work under some of the same kind of rules. Now, around that same time, 1920s, 1930s, look at that. There's that Department of Commerce showing up. So the US Department of Commerce, our federal government, was getting a lot of complaints around 1920s, 1930s from the citizens saying, hey, man, our cities are just going wild with these building codes. They're so focused on having the most beautiful city and getting reelected that they're creating these most unrealistic codes, and it's making construction too expensive for us. Ding, 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 ding. Construction too expensive. That caught the attention of our federal government, right? Because our GDP, the gross domestic product, the US, is so heavily reliant on construction. Construction employs so many people. It develops so many products. It drives so much transportation that from a federal level, the federal government is saying, hey, we got to do something to help these cities not squash construction. We need construction. And so as you can see here, the federal government creating documents, recommended minimum requirements, recommended, because as I said, the federal government has no more authority in creating building codes than we the people do. And so then this transferred on. I'm going to skip through a bunch of history because I can only spend so much time on these subjects. After we had the National Board of Fire Underwriters, they were focused on fire, but building officials, inspectors, plan reviewers, the people serving these communities across the US, they said, hey, we kind of like this idea of this model code created by a third party. but they only address fire. And we want to address structural provision and egress provisions. We really want to take this idea further. So it ended up creating 3 different individual nonprofit organizations in the US that represented the building code and building official industry. And so we had 3 different model code groups here, plus the National Board of Fire Underwriters. And we were back to just codes were off the wall all over the place. So as things now, we talk about things becoming more global. Back in this time, we were just trying to get the one nation to kind of get more consistent together. And so in 1994, International Code Council was formed, and that brought together those 3 independent code organizations into one. To now, let's have one model code that we will now promote to governments, just like the fire underwriters did in the 1920s, to say, hey, governments, we think this is a good code for you. You know what that is, guys? It's lobbying. Now, lobbying comes with such a negative connotation out there. That's for a different discussion. But lobbying is nothing more than recommending to a government to adopt something as the rule or whatever. And so the ICC is essentially collective lobbying, where we can all work together to create these model codes that are recommended. All right, so let's get into that real quick. ICC model codes. Now that we've kind of quickly zoomed through a high level of history, we are where we are today, where the International Code Council is the leading organization to produce these recommendations to governments for construction standards. And so the big one, right, the big title is the International Building Code, the IBC. And this covers all non-residential occupancies, obviously residential, right? Like places people are living, eating, sleeping, cooking, our homes. Residential is such a unique occupancy type compared to all the other types of occupancies. Like, is it a mercantile business? Is it an office business? Are we manufacturing hazardous materials? They all have unique things as well, but something to really clearly understand when it comes to code is we treat residential occupancies in a very unique and particular way compared to all other occupancies. That's related to a few different things, one of them being our freedom. You know, we do have kind of an ingrained sense of freedom in this country, and when we get into our own private homes, our expectations for freedom go way up. And that works good in the building codes because that's what else we have: familiarity. The more familiar you are with your environment, then you're more familiar with the hazards of your environment because you wake up to them every single morning. I live in a 1958 house. I know all about waking up to known hazards every morning. I'm working on cleaning them up. But that's the difference. One of the differences we get. We can be more risky and we can have more freedom because it is our own private place and we are more familiar with that. And then for the safety part of it, we're sleeping. Anywhere that people are sleeping, our reaction time is delayed. And then that increases our hazard on the flip side the other way. So anyway, some quick commentary about why I focused on sharing with you about this separation in this Codes 101 as residential occupancies versus non-residential. So anyway, the IBC is the full gamut, all of it. You can build everything, any type of building, any type of occupancy. However, when it comes to building homes, this book has got so much in it that we don't really need, and it can make things more complicated. You ever heard that saying, less is more? Well, that's kind of recognized here. So what we get in the scope section of this code is this exception that says, hey, your detached 1 and 2 family dwellings or townhouses, that means that we've limited how many different families that don't know what each other are doing and the hazards that they're creating. We've limited how many are in one building. So we can limit some of the safety rules, right? And we can create that simplified code book, the IRC. But as you see here, we get this statement with these exceptions: 1 and 2 family dwellings, 3 stories or less above grade, right? We're putting some boundaries on the hazard. It's a lot harder to get out of a 10-story building than a 3-story building. So we see these clarifiers, and then it says, you shall comply with this code, the IBC, or the International Residential Code. So giving an option to say, yes, this code is ready to cover every building in your jurisdiction, but you could also use this other code, the residential code, that might be a better fit. And in most cases, I mean, almost all cases, that's what you're going to find, is that the government jurisdiction has adopted the residential code. And so folks will look at this and go, I could use the IBC, but I'm going to use that easier IRC. Except I said most, right? So let's give you a Colorado example. Here is the adoption for Aspen, Colorado. And if we look here, we can see their past building codes in 2015, they did adopt the IRC, that simplified book for 1 and 2 family dwellings, 3 stories or less, and a few other nuances. But as we notice here with their most recent adoption, Aspen said, you know what? For whatever reasons, they felt they could better serve their community by not adopting the IRC this round and instead utilizing the IBC and all these other codes I'm about to show you for all of their buildings. So again, an anecdotal example, and this is a very rare example, but I show it to you because it is Colorado and it is part of 101. Just because something is rare or just because 99% of something occurs doesn't mean we can ignore the 1% time when it might actually be different. That's part of Codes 101. All right, so what about a building that's already existing? It was built in 1958, like my house, or maybe it's even older than that. Well, we want to keep these buildings. I mean, it's much more costly from a sustainability standpoint, environmental standpoint, and just economic standpoint for just tearing down entire buildings and building them all perfectly safe to the new and latest code. So the codes have always said, we need to find a way that we can keep some of our existing building stock and enhance it and just make it safer. And when people want to go in and alter a building or change its occupancy or do a repair or an addition, let's make sure that we help make it feasible. And so that means sometimes softening down some of the requirements. Now, again, you see here all residential occupancies and all non-residential, and you get the same exception as I showed you before that says, well, or you could use the IRC, not in Aspen though, right? And that'll be the same statement. So I stopped picking on Aspen or pointing them out, but that'll be the same thing you're going to see with all these other ones. In a location that didn't adopt the IRC, well, you would be going to look at the IEBC. And as I've already kind of mentioned in my rambling here, this is about existing buildings. So this applies to repairs, alterations, changes of occupancy, and then additions. I mean, and for additions, it basically says, hey, that addition's new, comply with current code. But there's nuances to all of this with that goal of being, we need to help existing buildings continue to be used. And if people want to upgrade them and enhance them and make them better, let's not punish them by saying, oh, no, tear it all down and rebuild it from the ground up. No, let's help hold their hand and let's help guide into enhancing the safety of these older buildings, even if it's not the safety we get out of a brand new building. All right, so next we get the International Fire Code. And this is, I would also call kind of a unique code. There's so much more I could tell you about this fire code, but I'm going to keep it as short and sweet as I can today. But this is definitely, I would definitely say this is a unique code from some of the other ones. It's not as heavily involved with new construction. It has a lot to do with how we're using our buildings, what we're putting in our buildings, and the safe occupancy and use of the building after we've already finished building it. And now all residential occupancies, all non-residential occupancies, and this also has a little bit of a nod to the IRC, but in a slightly different way. We'll see in this section of the IFC, it says where structures are built in accordance with the IRC, then only these 2 items here are what are required to comply with the IFC. So in a nutshell, most of your single family homes, 2-family homes, townhouses are built in jurisdictions that have adopted the IRC. And in that case, this is really only going to apply to things related to the exterior of the building, identifications of addressing, water supply to the site, like your hydrants, things like that. Things related, I would say, a lot more to the overall development where these houses are located. But if it's a residential structure not under the IRC, then it would, all your other residential occupancies are going to still need to comply with the IFC. And so, real quick summary on this, as I kind of talked about, this is about materials and products and items, not so much that the building is made out of, but that are being stored in the building or even stored outside of the building. A tire scrapyard, a mound of tires is a fire hazard. So IFC will address things like a mound of tires outside of your building on the site. So it extends to a lot more of that stuff. And then also I would say, in a way to kind of capsulate the IFC, is everything related to active fire protections as opposed to passive fire protection. Passive fire protection is like a 2-hour fire rated wall. It doesn't move, it doesn't function, it's not electrically powered or pneumatically powered, it's just this wall. That's going to be under the building code or the residential code. But when you get into something active, like a system, like a fire sprinkler system or a kitchen hood suppression system over your kitchen cooking appliances, or even having to place a fire extinguisher in locations in certain occupancies. These are all active fire protections that the IBC might require that to be there, but then doesn't give you any method for how to do it. It points you over to the IFC to say, okay, now follow the IFC. All right, well, we do like running water and sewer in our homes, right? This is one of our oldest codes, besides fire protection that we can get back to the 1600s on. Health codes also are hundreds of years old because we've known that we want potable water for a long time. The old "don't throw the baby out on the bathwater" saying. It's because we didn't have sewers and they just threw it out into the streets. So health codes are like the old plumbing codes, and now we call them plumbing code, right? And so the International Plumbing Code, again, all types of buildings, residential or non-residential, but there's that exception again saying, hey, you can also just use the IRC, and that might be a little easier because it's specific to the 1 and 2 family dwellings, 3 stories or less. And so the plumbing code here for the International Plumbing Code by ICC, to summarize in one sentence, I would say this is basically all of your plumbing design and installation codes and requirements and provisions for anything plumbing related other than fuel gas. So other than like propane or natural gas systems. Otherwise, you're going to find it here. And in modern versions, newer versions of the IPC, you're also getting things like gray water systems. A lot of these things that are a little more alternative are now we're seeing these come into this with a standardized method to where they can be used. Now, FYI, this I'm mostly talking to you about ICC stuff, and this is what we see here in Colorado when we get to that. But I will mention there is another organization that does compete with creating a model plumbing code, trying to get the governments to adopt it. There's competition. So some governments will say, no, we're going to use the Uniform Plumbing Code, and others the International Plumbing Code. And side note, the Uniform Plumbing Code does include fuel gas. The International Plumbing Code does not. So next up is mechanical code. Mechanical, this is like HVAC. Anytime I'm talking about the mechanical code to just regular old people in the world, they're going to give you the deer in headlights. Mechanical code, what, like automobiles? I thought you were a building person in construction. I always just say, HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. That's kind of a more common layman's way or common folk way to refer to the mechanical code. And I'm boring you to death with this, but it is being sure I'm being sufficient in covering this. Yes, it's the same thing. This book can cover all buildings, and in places that don't adopt the IRC, this is what you're going to use for your home, your single family house, because we see that same statement. But guess what? Most folks are going to follow the OR and go with the residential code. And so this one in a nutshell covers your heating, your cooling, and your ventilation systems, all except for fuel gas, just like the plumbing code, and all except for solid fuel fireplaces and chimneys. So solid fuel fireplaces and chimneys aren't like a device. They're not like a pellet stove. They're not made by a manufacturer and have to and tested as some complete unit to be delivered on site. They're built out of bricks and mortar. What does that sound like? That sounds like building out of like wood or steel, building, right? So we're going to find chimneys and fireplaces are in the building code and in the residential code. But when we get to appliances and packaged kind of appliances, equipment that might be solid fuel burning, well, now we might end up back in the International Mechanical Code. And then again, fuel gas, not in this. And similar to the Uniform Plumbing Code, that same organization, IAPMO, which again has tremendous history going back into the mid 1900s, but I won't, I'm biting my tongue on that, but they also have a competing uniform mechanical code. Here in Colorado, these are not what we see governments adopting. All right, so where is fuel gas, Glenn? You keep saying it's not in the plumbing code, it's not in the mechanical code. That's because it's in its own code, the International Fuel Gas Code. And again, same thing, you can use this or the IRC, and this is for fuel gas design and installation. You know, we're not going to have a great building without electricity. So that's part of it, like plumbing, HVAC, we need electricity. This is our MEP trades that you'll often hear referred to, MEP, mechanical, electric, plumbing. Well, guess what? ICC does not touch electrical. This has history going back to the late 1800s. The National Electrical Code is managed and developed. Everything that handles with it, its publishing is all through the National Fire Protection Association. And so it's known as the NFPA 70 standard, but most people will refer to it as NEC, National Electric Code. And, you know, just to give a quick nod back to kind of what I mentioned at the beginning of this, where did these first model codes start from? The National Board of Fire Underwriters. And this is a copy of the 1953. It goes back another 60 years. But as you can see, yep, this all started with those fire underwriters as well. So some commonality in this history. All right, then Energy Conservation Code. And this one is a slight different approach to how it looks at residential. And we're not going to see that same boring exception I keep showing you. It's going to be a little different. This one says this applies to residential buildings. And you notice residential is italicized. That means we got to go to the definitions. I'll tell you about that in just a little bit. And in the definitions part of this book, it tells us residential means 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. That's the stuff under the IRC, right? But also beyond that, its groups are R2, R3, and R4. And this is when you get into other types of residential occupancies, apartment buildings, dormitories. This R2, R3, R4 is where you can get a 100-story skyscraper of all residential. Well, this is where we can see, okay, if it's group R2, 3, or 4, and it's still that 3 stories or less, then under the IEC, it's considered residential in the same as the IRC related buildings, the 1 and 2 family dwellings. But if it's group R2, R3, or R4, and it's more than 3 stories, then you're going to be kicked into the non-residential or the commercial provisions of this IECC. I'll show you a little more about this code as we go on, but it's definitely another unique one that's kind of designed in a little bit of a unique way. All right, I've mentioned this enough times, I should probably get to showing it to you, right? The IRC. And this is that simplified book for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. And townhouses has a very specific definition, but it allows you to do an infinite number of individual living units in one building, but with some controls on it to reduce hazard and allow them to be built under this more simplified code. Now, this code has some history that started in 1971. This is a time that our contractors and our designers, our architects across the US started saying, hey, we're sick of 4 different codes. We need uniformity. We need you guys to come together and give us just a code just for residential that includes building, plumbing, mechanical, electrical, everything we need. Just one. I don't want to buy 5 different books. And so that's a little bit of the history of where it started from. And here we are today with the International Residential Code. And that's right. It's one book for homes. So if you look at the IRC, there's a couple unique things here. The plumbing and mechanical that are in this book are developed independently from plumbing and mechanical for commercial buildings like the IPC, the IMC. But when we get to the fuel gas provisions, they are not developed independently. So chapter 24 of the IRC just pulls out the provisions related to 1 and 2 family dwellings and reprints them exactly in the IRC in the same way that they're printed in the IFGC. We see this again with the energy code, with what I just talked about, the energy code. Any of the provisions in this code that apply to the 1 and 2 family dwellings have been pulled out and reprinted in chapter 11. So we don't have to buy multiple books, right? We want to make it easy for the public to understand and comply with code. And then chapters 34 through 43, these are the electrical chapters, and they come verbatim from the National Electric Code. And in all of these chapters, you even get little parenthetical pointers so that you can correlate. If you're in the IRC and you're reading an electrical code, it'll give you the article number from the NFPA 70, the electrical code, so you can go, if you wanted to go to that big book and read where the source of it was. And then I will mention, right, we have existing homes that people want to remodel, rehab, finish basements. And wouldn't we want to have the same concept we have for commercial buildings? Let's make it easier for folks to stay in their home, expand their home, update their home, fix their home. And let's not punish them by making them, oh, that's not up to current code, tear it all apart. And so there's an appendix chapter in the IRC called Appendix AJ, and it's kind of similar to the IEBC. Now, it's not an exact like the three on the side. It doesn't just pull the provisions out, but I bring it up because it's similar and it addresses the same issues, but in that specific way for IRC buildings. All right, then we have some specialty codes. We got the International Wildland Urban Interface Code. And this covers everything: construction, alteration, movement, repair, maintenance for any building, residential or non-residential, in a wildland urban interface area. This is an area that when you follow this book and its guidance, it's basically saying, hey, this is a heightened area where a wildfire has a higher probability of spreading into this community. And this is something that was born in like the 90s, coming out of California is where we see the history from this. So a newer code in the big scheme of things, and one that is definitely gaining in popularity. We've all seen the news, right? And we know why. So what else do we get here? The International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. Again, all buildings, residential or non-residential. And this is about aquatic recreation facilities, pools, and spas. Now, you can go back in plumbing codes to the 70s and get codes from the IAPMO group about plumbing of swimming pools. But what this does is this pulls in more life safety related to swimming pools, trying to keep people from being stuck on, with drains. There's been some very horrible, horrible tragedies from people being trapped on drain inlets at the bottom of a pool. It addresses things like security barriers to keep young children that should not be trespassing into pools from ninja warrioring their way over gates and fences. So making it very hard for them to sneak in and inadvertently hurt themselves. So lots of good safety stuff here. This code, as we see it by the ICC, is very new. 2012 is its first edition. And so this is another one that we're seeing growing in adoption across the country. I will make a side note that a lot of people don't recognize, a lot of governments don't recognize this. In the latest editions of the IRC, starting since, I believe, the 2015, in section 327 of the IRC, you get a specific reference that says the design and construction of pools and spas shall comply with the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. And this is something to note because in this section of the IRC, it makes it very clear the codes referenced in this code are considered part of the requirements of this code to its full extent. So this is a weird one where jurisdictions may not actually legally adopt this code as an individual code, but if they overlook and they don't modify this reference to that code is still applicable. So this is something you have to check, with your local governments and say, did they adopt the swimming pool and spa code? And were they also savvy enough to eliminate the reference to it that is still in the IRC? So something unique that I wanted to bring up there. Then you have the International Property Maintenance Code. I'm not going to talk much about this. This is not very widely adopted. It does have a reference from the IRC that would have to be deleted if you don't want to use this as part of your government ordinances and regulations. And I can say for Colorado, I see in the work I do helping with adoptions, most people have eliminated this and not adopted this. And then you have the International Private Sewage Disposal Code. And this is basically for septic systems. And I'll talk a little bit about when we get into Colorado codes. So there's more time than I wanted to spend kind of going through, though, the whole family of codes by the ICC. And remember, these are just books. They might as well just be like Stephen King's latest novel. They have no power, authority. They are nothing but books until a government says, hey, we like that book and we think that book will serve our community well. Let's adopt that via reference. So we want to keep up with the changes in the world, right? You know, what iPhone number are you on? Like 27 or something? We're always innovating, coming up with new ideas, new technologies. And when it comes to buildings, we're always reevaluating what we think is hazardous, what we don't think is hazardous, what new hazards have we discovered. So all of these codes get redeveloped and republished every 3 years. This is just kind of a collage of the IRC. And this has been going on. In fact, in the old days, we used to revise the code every year, like the International Conference of Building Officials with their uniform building code. Every year it got revised to keep up. Now we're in a 3-year cycle. I just love this real quick. This is a quote from the 1927 code, so 100 years ago. Wherever the Uniform Building Code can be improved, it's the desire of the conference to improve it, for it's not and never will be perfect, right? So this is why we fix it all the time. Now, I'll caution you at the wrong time and place to tell somebody the code's not perfect. Don't say you heard it from me, okay? That's meant to be a little ha-ha for you. I try to sneak as much fun as I can. I mean, it's building codes. So I hope you get that joke. That's a nice little stock photo of an angry inspector. All right, so organization of model codes. Boy, I'm running behind a little, but don't worry, some of these ones will go kind of quick. As you see, I go pretty quick through my stuff here. So organization. First of all, don't jump into the technical part of a code until you understand how to use the code, what the limit of authority is, what the responsibility of the various players are. How do you deal with references? This is essentially the how-to for the code is chapter 1, scope and administration. It's a bunch of boring stuff, but it's some of the most important stuff for truly understanding how to actually use the rest of the book. Chapter 2 in all of our iCodes are definitions, because, you know, sometimes a word doesn't give us enough intent and purpose of how that word's supposed to be used when we're dealing with it in the code. So we have pages and pages of definitions where anytime you see this word come up in the code, don't use the everyday use of that word. Use that word how it's defined in the code. And man, this is a foundational code 101 thing. Got to take you back real quick to 1884, the London Building Acts. And what do we see in 1884? Not at chapter 2, but at the very beginning of the book, definitions. So this concept of having unique terms in the code that apply in unique ways, it's 101, man. It's 101. Now, I said that's in chapter 2, and it is in chapter 2 of all the iCodes. But remember, the IRC is a weird one because we've pulled verbatim from 3 other codes into this IRC. So caution, chapter 2 of IRC is definitions for the IRC as a whole. But there are also definitions in chapter 24 that come from chapter 2 of the IFGC. Chapter 11 definitions that come from chapter 2 of the IECC, and same with the electrical code that come from the definitions from the NFPA's code. So there's 4 different places to find definitions in the IRC. Remember, it's a little unique. Then at the end of these code books, we get a chapter for referenced standards, right? Like that International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. You could go to the IRC and look up ICC, and it's a reference standard because it's not just referencing standards from standard organizations, but these codes may also reference other iCodes. So a real quick and super useful tool when you're trying to find, I know that there's some reference to the AAMA for fenestrations in this code, but I just don't know where it is. You can go to the reference standards chapter, look up the standard organization. Sometimes they have multiple standards, find that, and then it'll tell you kind of like an index in the code book. Oh, this is in table C402.5.5. And then you can go and you can read the extent of that reference. And then finally, we get appendix chapters at the very end of all of these codes. And these are essentially optional parts of the code where a government can choose. In the same way they can choose to amend or change parts of a code, they can also then look at all the appendix chapters and individually decide which of these appendix chapters they want to adopt into their regulations. And that's definitely something to look at. Appendix chapters range from helpful guidance to alternative methods of construction. The IRC appendix chapters, there are many, many of them. They continue to grow with more alternative methods of construction. And what am I going to show you with appendix? It's 101. It's also very old. That was an appendix chapter for sizing of gas pipe, right? Well, look, here I can take you to the 1943 gas code for city gas. This is the origin of our gas codes today. And there it is again, the National Board of Fire Underwriters. Boy, they just keep coming up, don't they? And what do we see back in 1943? An appendix chapter for sizing of pipe, just like we have in the IFGC and IRC chapter appendix today. So I just think that's cool, right? Some things have changed and some things haven't. So very important things for Code 101 and understanding how to use codes is absolutely, my friends, never forget the little letters, the footnotes in your tables. So right now, if you look at this table, you might be extracting a number. You're trying to find out some maximum span of 6'6". Well, I can tell you in this particular table, if you don't read that footnote E, you are possibly not getting the correct answer at all. You notice footnote E would say you have to reduce that number by 70% or by 30%, excuse me. And so super critical, like footnotes aren't just added little bits of information. Footnotes can completely alter the answer that you thought you correctly pulled from the table. So never, ever, ever forget the footnotes. And then with footnotes, F and F, right? Footnotes and figures. Figures are another important thing. These are not just a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, hey, I already read all 1,000 words, so I don't need the picture. Wrong. You see the little box I have over here? Those words are not located anywhere else in the code. Those words are not in some section number. So the pictures in the code are not just replacements for the words. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they duplicate what the words say. But a lot of times these figures provide critical information that does not appear in the regular text of the code. All right, adoption and amendments of code. So I already said, right, the Constitution, no federal government authority. Real quick, I actually have a YouTube video on my YouTube channel where I'm showing you building codes written by George Washington and revised by Thomas Jefferson from an 1808 newspaper that I have. Well, hey, Glenn, I thought you said those are presidents. That's federal government. They can't have authority over that. But this is part of understanding our civics, right? The city of Washington was what they were writing codes for in the 1800s. Yes, the presidents writing building codes in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. is not one of the United States, is it? So we get some weird special stuff there. But that's just a little anecdote where, in a way, we have that part of the federal government. So right, we've got this beautiful United States with all these 50 states. We can be together and be different. And then inside of individual states, we might also be able to be together but different. And these are all the little counties in Nebraska. Is an old slide. I guess like for a Colorado one, I should do Colorado, huh? Well, that depends. That depends on the state. Because remember, the state gets authority over building codes. So some states write a statewide building code. Other states are called home rule states, where they say, no, we're not going to do a statewide building code. We're going to let every individual community, city and county do their own codes. Yes, it can be more difficult for construction professionals and designers, and I could argue that. But on the flip side, it also lets communities be unique and address their unique situations, like Aspen as an example. It's a unique community, I think we agree. So they were able to make some unique decisions for their community. Now, again, we may have states that change codes at the state level when they adopt them, or they may allow the local jurisdictions to. Colorado is a home rule state. Real quick, why might these governments want to change the model code? Why do they think they know better than this model code developed through this great open process? Well, the leading answer, guys, and I'm kind of being cynical, I guess, but it's simple. We're human. We're weird. You know, why do your kids sometimes not listen to you when they really know they should? It's just because they don't want to, because they don't like you. I don't know, right? I mean, sometimes things that us humans do, this is the only answer. It's like, well, we're human. Okay. So we can, you guys, I think, got that message. And why else might governments change the code? They might have some history. They might be like, yeah, this hazard is not very probable in the big scheme of things, so it's not required in the code recommended to all these governments. But you know what? Here in this town, this hazard has happened 3 times in the past 10 years. So we know this is a hazard for us. So due to our history, we want to address this, right? So there may be some examples like that. And then also, we are unique, we're different, and we have lots of weird local customs and challenges and weird communities that got built in weird ways. And so we need to make the codes address these things in our unique ways. And so those are times that you'll see that code get amended. All right, so let's hop in real quick to Colorado codes. This will be a quick part because, again, I'm just going to hit you on some high-level stuff to encourage you to go and investigate more. If you live in Colorado, your relationship with your government is really your responsibility first and foremost. I'm going to help tap you on the shoulder, point you to some things you should look at, but you need to pay attention to the speed limits on the roads you choose to drive. So this is where I'm going to empower you to say, this is your responsibility, my fellow citizens. So let's look at some Colorado codes and how Colorado looks at this. Colorado is a home rule state, so we do not have a statewide building code. What we do have is a statewide plumbing code, and they reference the model codes, the international codes, and they've adopted some changes to both the plumbing code for the commercial occupancies and your multifamily residential, as well as residential codes. And then we also have a statewide electrical code. So there are counties in Colorado with no building code and no building department and no building permits, but the state still has authority over those places, and you may still need to get a plumbing permit and inspection or electrical permit and inspection. Now, I can tell you real quick, historically, these have been the codes that the state has adopted and put at the state level. And one of the big reasons for that is licensing of trades professionals, plumbers, and electricians. So part of the reason we have these codes is not just for the code, but it's also for licensing our service providers, our tradespeople. It's kind of hard to have a license for a plumber if you have no code that you're testing or evaluating that plumber to. So these kind of go hand in hand with licensing requirements in the state, as well as then creating an adopted code for that. Now, more recent, in the last 10 years or so, Colorado has approved some legislation for a statewide energy conservation code. And that's obviously the root of what's allowing me to share with you here today is, hey, we're bringing in a new energy code statewide. We better also help people learn and understand this code. And then even more modern, I mean, this is still happening right now and underway, is the creation of a statewide wildland urban interface code for fighting wildfire or for reducing the hazard of wildfires burning down our communities. And so our state is currently working on that. We have had some legislation saying you need to get that together. So much more. I have a whole 1-hour webinar just on that. So that's enough for today on that subject. This is what we get in Colorado, past and current. And then one last thing, septic systems. I just figured I'd bring it up. I showed you that International Private Sewage Disposal Code. We do not adopt that in Colorado. Colorado has Regulation 43 for on-site wastewater treatment regulations. So another example here where, yes, the state still wants us to safely and sanitarily dispose of our wastewater in places that we don't have a municipal wastewater system. But they do not use the I codes for that. They have their own regulations. All right, and finally, right, this is what brings us to building energy codes, Colorado Energy Office, and being able to provide this for you today. And look at this, is really cool, guys. If you go to the Colorado Energy Office website, as Erica said, this is going to get revamped, but this will, I hope, still be there. You can go down to this link right here, for Colorado building and energy codes by jurisdiction. And it's this awesome GIS map. I'm so impressed by this. And it brings up counties and cities in Colorado and will help guide you and hold your hand into understanding what codes have been adopted there. Now, what's the most foolproof thing to do, though, after you start with a tool like this, is contact your local building department. Go to the local building department's website. This is a starting point for you getting an understanding of a local community in Colorado. And then finally, Erica's over there biting her tongue. She's like, Glenn, you're going overtime again. I tend to do that. But let me throw you through a little bit with the energy code, and I'm going to make sure I get you through the part I really wanted to, that it doesn't come up in any of the other classes. It's a little bit of the history of the energy code. And then I'll quickly, with time, just take you through a quick little layout of how this energy conservation code is laid out. So here comes that inspiring part of my presentation. Here comes that part where I'm just kind of whispering a few things in your ear. If you're not interested, then you're like, you bat me away like a dirty fly. Or maybe you're interested and you're like, man, I'm going to use Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever search engine. I'm going to go learn more about this. Okay. So this is designed to be that way. How far back can I take the International Energy Conservation Code? I can take it back to the 1934 National Housing Act, which was all about trying to make homes more affordable for people to not foreclose on them back during the Great Depression. History repeats itself, guys. If you're wondering about what's happening today with affordable housing and things like that and mortgages, you might find a lot of interest to Google the 1934 National Housing Act, because this started to create the first sort of federal codes for buildings, but not really. So that act created the Federal Housing Administration, which did create federal minimum property standards, but no authority over new construction. It was all about borrowers, insurers, and lenders. Nobody wants to insure a house that's like, best guess how grandpa built it. Nobody wants to lend you money for a 20, 30-year mortgage. Best guess how grandpa built it, right? They want to have some confidence to insure and to lend on homes. That's what this was all about. But guess what? When I crack open my 1958 version of this book is where I can take you back to the oldest I can find of sort of a governmental statement about insulation. And look at that one, heat loss through ceilings, an R value of 6.7 for ceilings. You think we've come a long way since then with insulation? Anyway, so a little bit about the FHA and why this doesn't have any authority on what we do in new construction. This was all about mortgages and insurance. We're going to fast forward from 1958 to the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which oddly sounds very modern at the moment. And it may be something you might want to Google yourself and enlighten yourself on our wild history. But what this led to was the 1973 oil embargo, where the U.S. could no longer get oil from certain folks because we got involved in certain things. And I encourage you to go explore that to your desire. And so we started realizing, hey, we probably need to like think about how we're getting energy here in the U.S. because they're not shipping it to us anymore from other parts of the world. So people look to this FHA thing, and that was very controversial. Hey, we're not putting energy codes in this. This is not about that. This was never meant for saving energy in America. This is meant for insurers and for mortgage people. So there was some real, like, don't muddy the waters with this, right? Well, the US is a unity of states. Federal government has no authority over this, but the federal government does have a lot of money and resources and research. And so these states got together in 1973 and had a conference of the states and said, hey, this is on us, guys. The oil embargo, we're freaking out about energy, and how are we going to afford all this? We got to do better with energy, and this is on us. But then the states said we need help, so they got the National Bureau of Standards, federal government, which is now NIST, to say, hey, we want some help from you, federal government, to help us states figure this out. And at that time is when the idea of multiple compliance paths was born, because it was so controversial. People were like, wait, you're going to start mandating insulation on us? And so, quick little note, this is where from the very beginning it was done sensitively, where it's like, we have to give people choices of how to do this. But anyway, so the state started saying, what are we going to do? We need to address energy. Well, they went to look at the American Society of Heating and Ventilation Engineers because since 1926, these engineers have already been analyzing and evaluating the science of heat movement through buildings. Like in 1926, they were thinking, how does heat move through buildings? But it hadn't become policy, it hadn't become code. It was just a book of knowledge, right? So many cool books of knowledge out there that we can read before they become mandated by government, too, by the way. So fast forward in time, ASHRAE is the new name for this, right? And so the states go, well, why don't we look to these folks to try to help us with this? They've been doing it since 1926. And so in 1975, you get the ASHRAE standard, energy conservation in new building design. First ever. There you are, looking at a snapshot of the cover. And so this was meant to now give some guidance to where states could adopt this and then mandate and create policy that we're going to build our buildings to be energy conserving and consider this oil embargo going on. Problem is it's a standard, and standards are written for professionals. Standards were written with air conditioning engineers in mind. They aren't something real easy and user-friendly for building officials and building departments and contractors and tradespeople. So if we can fast forward a little further, a few more years, and the federal government in 1976 enacted the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And this is when they started providing funding for the creation of a model energy code, education, all this stuff. And this funding is what is funding us basically still today. Various acts that have been redone by the federal government to assist states, because they have no authority, but they can assist in research and funding. And it all started back here in 1976. Anyway, they reached out to CABO. Remember this picture? That's the original IRC. Well, the federal government's like, hey, we already got all these building official organizations together writing a book for single family homes. Why don't we give them the money? Why don't we work with them and get them to take that ASHRAE knowledge from the standard and create a model energy code? Now, you also had the BOCA organization creating their own over there. So anyway, this was all done through federal education, federal support to create the codes, to help with education, help with adoption. And like I say, I wanted to share all this history because it's all what leads us to where we are today. It still continues where the federal government can still provide a lot of resources for the individual states to then make their choices. And so, you know, Colorado has made its choices, and here we have all this educational support. So finally, I'll wrap up real quick. This will be fast with just kind of showing you a quick breakdown of the IECC. This is what I told you guys before. Remember that I said that it's directly reprinted. See this language in the IECC? It's section 101.3. And if you go to the IRC, chapter 11, look, it puts in parentheses the number to give you a pointer back to this code. So you see this with the fuel gas code and with the electrical code as well. FYI, because this is in my slide, you can read all the codes for free, including the new 2024 model codes at codes.iccsafe.org. Now, I have a whole webinar, two-part webinar on Chapter 11, kind of taking you through the energy code in Chapter 11. But hey, guess what? There are two recorded webinars available on the Colorado Energy Office's YouTube. And this is part 1 and part 2 that I did, looks like 6 months ago. So there's two 1-hour webinars that'll take you much deeper into just Chapter 11 of the IRC. And then I'm going to finish this up real quick with just this. Remember, I talked about the IECC is unique in the way it kind of deals with non-residential versus residential versus high-rise residential. And so this book is laid out different than any of the other I codes. It's literally 2 books in one. Commercial provisions are the first part of the book, and it goes through chapters 1 through your appendix. And then in the second half of the book, you start with residential, and it works its way through. But if you notice, right, so, sorry, commercial is on this side, first part of the book, residential is on this side. These are the definitions. But again, that organization I talked to you guys about is still the same. It's just literally like 2 books added into one. So the chapter 1 for both halves is scope and administration. Chapter 2, definitions. Chapter 3, general requirements. And in general requirements is things like the climate zones and what's a low energy building and labeling of insulation, identifying R values, right? General stuff. Chapter 4 for both of these halves of the book are the heavy chapters. That's the big one, man. Chapter 4 on both of these, that's the biggie. That's where all of your insulation values, your different methods of compliance, your air sealing, your mechanical systems, lots of mechanical system stuff in the commercial one versus residential. So chapter 4, man, that's the biggie. Chapter 5, existing buildings, right? Just like the IEBC or Appendix J in the IRC for the building code. Well, the energy code does it the same way. Hey, if we're modifying an existing home, let's be considerate of that and let's have unique rules for that or an existing commercial building. And then what? Chapter 6, reference standards. And then what do you get? Also, appendix, right? So everything laid out the same. It's just two books in one. Well, I did it again. I had a little more content than I typically want. I know I move fast, but that's why these are recorded. And you guys can go back and double check the recording. And there should be some time for Q&A, but I did eat that up a little bit, but I am still happy to ramble with you guys about any questions you may have. Thanks so much. I had a blast.
Thanks, Glenn. That was a jam-packed session, but as Glenn said, you guys can always reference that at a later point. And yeah, Glenn and I will stay on the line for questions that come in. And otherwise, thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and we hope to see you at our next few webinars. Thanks again.